I saw the sort of not just the colonization of Palestine as part and parcel to the ongoing Indian wars, but the way that you can define the geopolitics of that region through the lens of the liberation of Palestine and where people stand on that particular issue, because every imperial intervention that the United States has entered into to sort of dominate the so-called Middle East has been about the question of Palestine, right? And so it's central to not only the strategic interests of the United States, but it's also part and parcel to the cultural narrative that the United States tells itself as a sort of settler colonial nation in alliance with another settler colonial nation.
Hi, and welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm Yumna Patel, the Palestine news director at Mondoweiss. We're joined in conversation today with a very special guest, Nick Estes, lead editor at Red Media. Nick is a Lakota activist, writer, and scholar. His work focuses on, among many topics, settler colonialism, indigenous history, and decolonization. He's also the author of Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. That book is out now in paperback with the new afterword with Haymarket Books. Nick has also been an outspoken advocate for Palestinian liberation and covers the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the intersection between the struggles of Palestinians and indigenous peoples in America on the Red Nation podcast. Nick, thank you so much for being here. We've been eager to sit down with you for a long time, so we're glad that we're getting the chance to finally do that. We've got a lot to talk about. We're going to be covering an array of topics today, from the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the shared struggle between indigenous peoples in Palestine and the Americas, cowboys and settlers, and so much more. So let's get into it. As we mentioned earlier, you've been a longtime advocate for Palestinian liberation, and it seems like a no-brainer that as an indigenous person, you would care about the Palestinian struggle. But I wanted to ask you, as a Native person, or just as a human being, why does Palestine matter to you?
The first time I ever encountered the politics of Palestine and the U.S.'s role in the sort of colonization of Palestine was in high school. I read The Fateful Triangle by Noam Chomsky, which I don't know why I read that, but I read it. And, I grew up in a town of 2,100 people. It's a border town, Chamberlain, South Dakota, and had literally no one to talk to about this history. And it wasn't until 2006, I believe, when the elections in Gaza brought Hamas to power, that was actually a conversation that we were having in some circles, anti-war circles that I was a part of at the University of South Dakota. Again, not really being able to connect the sort of politics of Palestine to what we were doing at that time, but nonetheless, it was really deeply ingrained in who I thought I was at that time as an indigenous activist, as part of this anti-war movement against the Iraq war, against the Afghanistan war, but then also putting this into a larger context within the long Indian wars and the sort of verbiage that was used at that time to talk about Indian country as being enemy territory, and this sort of quote unquote, war on terror that was being waged against this feeling, right? Terror is a feeling. It's not a political ideology, but how that really went back to the founding of this country, which is codified in the Declaration of Independence and the 23rd claim against the King of England, which is to quote, the merciless Indian savages that inhabit the frontier of the United States, who engage in what Thomas Jefferson defined as a total war campaign against settlers, right? So that actually it inverted the sort of invasion paradigm to say that invasion is now a form of self-defense, right? And so when I began to think about Palestine, was actually how the Zionist, sort of narratives permeated how the United States talked about its quote unquote special relationship to the state of Israel, and Israel as an exceptional sort of state, much like the United States. And I didn't at the time have the sort of language to really talk about it until this sort of theory of settler colonial theory kind of came about in the academy. But nonetheless, I saw the sort of not just the colonization of Palestine as part and parcel to the ongoing Indian wars, but the way that you can define the geopolitics of that region through the lens of the liberation of Palestine and where people stand on that particular issue, because every imperial intervention that the United States has entered into to sort of dominate the so-called Middle East has been about the question of Palestine, right? And so it's central to not only the strategic interests of the United States, but it's also part and parcel to the cultural narrative that the United States tells itself as a sort of settler colonial nation in alliance with another settler colonial nation. And I think what happens, particularly on the progressive left in the United States, is a sort of erasure or a sidestepping of that cultural question to say, well, that's not really that powerful narrative. Maybe it existed at one point in time, but those sort of cultural depictions of the settler mentality in Zionist movements is actually almost an exact copy of this sort of cowboy mentality or the pilgrim, the myth of the pilgrim in the United States and the creation of a settler nation. So you can't actually disentangle the two. But I do think this sort of cultural power and the sort of culture war that exists right now in the United States against this sort of Zionist narrative about the exceptional state of Israel is important, because if you look at the student movements that are happening on campus, we're literally just challenging. They're just literally challenging that narrative that the Zionist project is sort of some sort of benevolent project. It's a way for the European nations, the global north, to sort of absolve itself of its own sort of fascist history without ever coming to terms with its own colonial history. But if that was such a sort of secured material narrative, then why is it that just challenging that narrative gets you fired from your job, gets you targeted, under surveillance by agents of the state? It shows that material sort of grip on power in Palestine is actually very precarious, because if you can challenge the cultural narrative, then you can challenge the sort of, that shows the precariousness of that sort of on the ground concrete occupation. And I think in the United States, you can hear people critique sort of the cowboy Western narrative, and it doesn't really translate into sort of the material narrative. But nonetheless, the fact that the myth of the cowboy, the myth of the pilgrim still persists in the United States demonstrates that there is a sort of material project at play that is called settler colonialism that has to be dealt with. So that's a long answer. But that's one element of it. The other element of it, which we can talk about later, is the solidarity between Native people in North America and the Palestinian movement in general. And that's something I learned. I didn't know that history growing up. It's something that I learned as an adult and had to uncover through various sort of, archival research, as well as interviewing elders of the Red Power movement. I went in 2019 with PalFest, the Palestinian Literature Festival. My book I don't think my book had published at the time, but nonetheless, I went to Palestine. You have to, I actually think I went through the Tel Aviv airport. There's this like heightened security about like entering Palestine. Why are you there for? Blah, 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 blah. That whole shebang. I think in the North, in the global North, people have so normalized this kind of hypersecurity culture that they don't realize that, that's maybe the same with the Zionist project in Tel Aviv, but actually the rest of the world doesn't really have that. So that was like the first kind of impression that I had. But getting on the ground, one of the things that I found most interesting, or at least compelling, was actually how small, quote unquote, small the landscape is compared to our territories, back home, which seems so open, and vast, but yet how intensified and spatialized this sort of project is. Like you said, you type in the GPS Bethlehem, but also like traveling as a Palestinian from wherever you are, and if you're in Ramallah to Bethlehem, or even to other sort of territories or other sort of cities or places in Palestine. If you're Palestinian, that's going to it might be just over that hill, but you have to go through a checkpoint. It's your freedom is measured in distances, right? And what's also wild is I remember waking up in Ramallah, and I could actually smell the sea, right? Which was, it doesn't seem like it's that close to the sea, but actually it is very close to the sea when you think about it. But yet the people who live in Ramallah probably cannot access the sea, probably have never seen the sea as far as I know, let alone, seeing their relatives in places like Gaza. So that to me was fascinating, because that's a throwback to when Native people were confined to reservations and had to get passes to leave. This was like the early 1900s. This system persisted up until probably about the mid 1930s, the pass system, and people could literally be shot and killed as they were, or sometimes they were hunted down. And so this common phrase in American politics, off the reservation, I'm not sure if you've heard of this, comes from this kind of very violent and genocidal history of confining Native people to Indian reservations, where they could be actually hunted down, shot, killed, imprisoned for leaving the reservation, as Palestinians are to this day. I think another sort of compelling thing that I experienced there was not so much the experience of Palestine, but the experience of white Americans, or Americans in general in Palestine, who saw like, wow, this is so awful. How could this happen? This is, so racist. And it's like, where do you, like, have you checked the color of your passport? Yeah. It's blue, like you have access to the entire world, because of your citizenship, your imperial citizenship. You have access to my homelands because of your imperial citizenship. Right. And so that was also really fascinating, is the utter disconnect between what is happening in Palestine as what is happening in Turtle Island. So that was, that was compelling. I think the other thing too, just some just really kind of quiet moments of the relationship that Palestinians have with like olive groves, or even sage. Sage is a big thing for Native people. Apparently, for Palestinians, like a cure-all for everything as well. So that was a cool thing. And I think just the kind of the visceral nature of the occupation, it doesn't just exist in people's heads. It's not like an abstract idea where you can explain settler colonialism to an average American, and it's just abstract. They can't actually connect it to, like you said, the town of Bethlehem. Like, why is a town in North America called Bethlehem? Why is why are cities called New York, New Orleans? Because they're named after European cities, right? Like they don't belong here. Or even the idea that like you take a monument like Mount Rushmore, right? Half of those presidents on Mount Rushmore weren't even presidents of that territory at that time, right? So they're projecting backwards in time this idea that the United States has always existed, and it hasn't. It's a very recent phenomenon given the long history of Native people in this continent, much as the state of Israel is a recent phenomenon in Palestine. So I thought those were fascinating. Also, the question of archaeology. We went to the Holy City, and my mom was a really devout Christian, and as part of, we were colonized as Christians as well. So I grew up reading these Bible stories, and there was also a disconnect for me, like in that like I went to the town of Bethlehem, and what was fascinating is like that's a Palestinian town. They don't really tell you that in my catechism. I wasn't taught that at all. But also how the entire Holy City has been reformed and retransformed into this sort of Zionist Disneyland to portray a certain myth. And like you can go to these holy sites in the Zionist context and see like large groups of American Christians visiting them, And so I think there's this whole conversation about Judaism and Zionism, but no, there's more Christian Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists, as far as I know. And they, that sort of ideology doesn't just like happen or play out on the ground in Palestine, but it also, like, those people are going home to colonized indigenous lands, right? So those are just some like brief thoughts. I also would say that the Palestinian tradition of resistance, the culture of resistance, was profoundly impactful for me. Like when you go to the refugee camps and you see the celebration of martyrs, right? The culture of resistance that exists is very, very profound. In the United States, you'll have people who talk about colonialism as something that's in the past, right? And if it was in the past, then, then undo all these draconian, archaic laws that define Native people as savages. These are things that are still in the books. These are codified. We are defined within federal Indian law and constitutional law as specific entities, political entities. And if we've moved beyond that, then undo an entire canon of law that draws from the doctrine of discovery, a Catholic Church doctrine, right? But that's the premise of this country, and so it's fascinating. It reveals and opens up possibilities for us as Indigenous people to imagine what a culture of resistance should and could look like, and how close freedom is for Palestinians in the sense, the geographic and political sense. So those are just some of the things that I'm also really taken by Palestinian poetry. It's like very moving. There's not, in Western society, there's this rejection of romanticism, which I think is just like a rejection of the soul in many ways, where that seems to be wholly embraced as a sort of a sixth sense, so to speak, of what it means to be engaged, in this kind of liberation struggle. And I feel like the kind of progressive movement in the United States has secularized itself to the point that it's not even reflective of how the rest of the world lives. I mean, you even go to liberation movements in this hemisphere and people are singing, they're dancing, they're praying, right? There's a deep spiritual commitment, and that's what we have. That's what has sustained our resistance movements as well. And they're constantly demonized, by liberals, by conservatives in the United States as sort of, the last vestiges of a dying culture, right? Or backwards sorts of view. And you see that same sort of demonization of Palestinian resistance, specifically the sort of anti-Islam or anti-Muslim sentiment that exists in the West. And it was just, it was a very beautiful experience. I'm kind of just yammering on because there's so many things to talk about, and I was there for such a short period of time that I felt like, but it always is very close to my heart, and it's something that I'll never forget.
It's incredible to hear you talk about your experience in Palestine, and like you said towards the end, you were only there for a short period, but it resonated with you so much on so many different levels. I'll never forget the first time that I went to Palestine. I mean, I was in college at the time, and it was the same thing. It was only for a few days, and I had grown up learning about Palestine. My family's originally from India and South Africa, and so, on one hand, we've been colonized by the British. My parents grew up under apartheid, and I remember taking them to Palestine for the first time, and it was like what you were talking about at the beginning, the permit system and having to be back in your area on curfew. Otherwise, you risk getting killed. I mean, that was something that was really stark to them. And when I went there, it was, like you said, we could learn about settler colonialism as an abstract, but it's not until you actually, I think for a lot of people, and it was like this for myself, it's not until you actually see it in action, in person, in such a small area, being practiced, that it really kind of hits you, the scale to which this is still happening. So, just hearing you talk about your experience in Palestine really resonated with me because it's just totally different to actually see it in real life. I want to ask you about, these connections between the Native struggle and the Palestinian struggle. Before I do that, though, when you were speaking, you mentioned Turtle Island. And so I just wanted to, for the audience, I wanted to ask you if you could define for folks what that is, for those who may not be familiar.
Sure. That terminology, as far as I know, comes from sort of Anishinaabe and beliefs that there's a continent sort of wide understanding of like what, North America is. But it's also kind of become a vernacular in indigenous movements to talk about indigenous people of North America and how we understand, in many ways we're very different. We've kind of been homogenized as Indian or as American Indian, as I prefer, because that's actually our legal standing with the United States government is American Indian. But we are also very distinct, right? In the sense that there's hundreds of different indigenous nations. So that's what Turtle Island means. It kind of represents that sort of aspiration of, indigenous people of North America without looking at, these kind of colonial borders of the U.S.-Canada border or the U.S.-Mexico border, and to understand that these things are relatively recent phenomenon and that our struggles aren't confined by, these settler states.
So I wanted to ask you about Native Palestinian solidarity. So you've done a lot of research on this topic. Could you tell us more, about this history and briefly how have these two struggles been inspired by one another?
I first encountered this because I was interested in this Lenape Shawnee activist named John Thomas. He was working with the International Indian Treaty Council, which is kind of like the international arm of the American Indian movement. And he wound up in Tehran in early 1980. And he flew into Tehran, and, the Iranian Revolution had happened and was kind of unfolding in certain ways. And they had taken over the U.S. Embassy. These Iranian students had taken over the U.S. Embassy and took captive, more than 50 U.S. citizens. And he showed up there, and, at that time, they had basically kicked out most of the U.S. press corps, the Western press corps, for various reasons. Because, just look at how Iran is portrayed in the U.S. media. And I think Edward Said actually wrote a book just on, basically on how the United States or the Western media portrays Iran. So he was there, but he was there as a diplomat for Indian sovereignty, American Indian sovereignty in the United States. And these students approached him and they said, "Do you want to meet one of the hostages?" And he's like, "No, I don't want to meet one of the hostages." But suffice it to say, he ended up running this kind of mail exchange program with the hostages that were taken and delivered their mail to their family in the United States. And what piqued my interest is like, well, why did that happen? Like, why did they trust this native dude who showed up? Well, first of all, he was there for a world liberation conference that brought together all these various struggles. He had just come from Lebanon. He was on a mission to meet with the heads of the Palestine Liberation Organization in Lebanon. And the status of the American Indian movement with the PLO at that time had earned them respect and trust with other liberation movements. And I thought that was like really fascinating because we've seen popular depictions like the Ben Affleck movie Argo, where it's like this kind of like CIA narrative about how they release these hostages. But this history was like fascinating to me because it's like, well, what are American Indians doing in Tehran, right? And why are they fulfilling this kind of humanitarian mission? Like, how did that ever come about? And so I began to ask some of our movement elders, people like Bill Means, who's an Oglala Lakota founder of the International Indian Treaty Council, longtime AIM member, people like Madonna Thunderhawk, who's also, she's Uhenupa or Two Kettles Lakota and Dakota. She was, an activist with the American Indian movement. And I asked them about this, and, they told me this kind of really like interesting history. They said, you have to remember, like after Wounded Knee in 1973, these sort of nobody really wanted, they thought that AIM has sort of just disappeared off the face of the map. Well, even before Wounded Knee, there was a movement called the Trail of Broken Treaties, which claimed, its central claim was that the treaties that the United States made with American Indian nations demonstrated the sort of international character of American Indian sovereignty. And that became the basis for which, they occupied Wounded Knee in 1973. And it also became the basis by which the American Indian movement helped found the International Indian Treaty Council in 1974. And the popular sort of media portrayal at that time sort of lost interest in AIM. They were like, they're cavorting with or collaborating with the Palestine Liberation Organization. They're collaborating with, the non-aligned movement. They're collaborating with the USSR. Like they are literally, they've lost the plot, and the liberal sort of press and the liberal support of AIM kind of just waned, and it just disappeared. But there's this really fascinating history. So the charge became that the American Indian movement, through the International Indian Treaty Council, would take its claims to the World Court against the United States, trying to hold it accountable for genocide of American Indians, but also trying to get a status of these treaties. They had no idea what they were doing. They set up office in New York City, and ironically enough, they set up office near the PLO office in New York City as well. And so they were learning from the lawyers of the PLO how to navigate this sort of complex superstructure of UN human rights law, et cetera, et cetera. But they were also, it opened a door to them where it's like, this struggle isn't just some sort of like racialized struggle of the Western Hemisphere of an Indian nation. It's also the struggle of an emerging nation engaged in an anti-colonial struggle, much like, the South African anti-apartheid movement was, underway at that particular time in these decolonizing nations in the so-called global South. So they saw themselves as part of this struggle, and in fact, they allied with the South African anti-apartheid movement and the Palestine, Liberation Organization. And one of the first, there was a committee, I can't remember the exact name, but it was the committee to sort of combat apartheid and colonialism and racism. And it was one of the first definitions, international legal definitions of Zionism as a form of racism that also connected the anti-apartheid movement. But it was also the first recognition of indigenous peoples as a category. Prior to that, it was just indigenous populations. So indigenous populations, a population is an internal sort of, demographic. It could be a minority, it could be a majority. In this case, it was an internal sort of state-based or state-defined sort of minority population with no international rights. So that was the first sort of recognition, right? And this opened the door for the International Indian Treaty Council and the indigenous internationalist movement at that particular time to begin advocating on the world stage, but also instead of going to the NATO countries, which some Native organizations actually did, they said, Europe is a better fit as an ally and as an alliance for our cause, because it's more palatable to our colonizers, our colonizing states, whether it's Canada, the United States, or whatever, or New Zealand or Australia. But AIM was like, well, that doesn't make sense. We should, have a struggle from below and look at other sister struggles that have more in common with us, and so Palestinians, are a stateless people at this particular time. They're fighting for a state. They're fighting for their nation. They're under occupation. And AIM often gets accused of being sort of like an anti-intellectual organization. They didn't have a large body of writing, etc. But in fact, in my research and talking with these elders as well, is that there was a lot of, they were meeting with human rights lawyers from the PLO and how to navigate these legal systems. They were also reporting this back to their own people. There was there was a local circulation of a newsletter called Oyate Wichaho, which had regular interviews. Oh yeah, by the way, Oyate Wichaho means voice of the people. It was a Dakota American Indian movement newsletter that had a circulation mostly on the reservation. So every day people were reading these newsletters and these report backs. They were reading about Northern Ireland. They were reading, or they were reading about the Irish, liberation struggle. They were reading about the Palestine liberation struggle. They were reading about the anti-apartheid struggle. They were reading about all of these movements and putting them into what they were calling at that time an anti-imperialist bloc, right? That was trying to imagine indigenous nations as an emerging sort of decolonizing nation. And they had to look at concrete examples. Leonard Peltier, during the Israeli and Zionist invasion of southern Lebanon, where they massacred over 30,000 people, Palestinians in southern Lebanon, wrote a letter in support of the PLO at that particular time. And if you don't know who Leonard Peltier is, he's the longest serving indigenous political prisoner in the United States. He saw at that moment in time, it was the early 80s when, AIM had sort of become irrelevant according to the liberal sort of press. They were still they were writing these, condemnations of Israel. They were making these connections. They were defining what settler colonialism is. You could actually read these newsletters and they're talking about settler colonialism. They didn't need Patrick Wolf. They didn't need academics to define it for them. All they needed was the concrete example of Zionism as a project, right? And you have to also remember that it's a really fascinating time. I don't want to romanticize it, but it shows this kind of deeper connection, right? And many of their lawyers at this time came from a radical Jewish tradition, and they too were anti-Zionists, So it wasn't like this movement that we see now, it's taken the mainstream, but it's not new. It's building on this longer tradition. And I think for Native people, we have to look back at that particular moment in time and to say that because maybe Red Power, didn't accomplish everything that it wanted to or needed to accomplish for our freedom and, struggle, but nonetheless, it represented that we have not been defeated. That we are still actively engaged in resistance and that we have a long tradition to draw upon. And while it may seem like this moment with the laws that have been implemented, criminalizing dissent in this country, the ongoing genocide, the bipartisan genocide of the entire political class in the United States, getting on board, these might seem like really dire and nightmarish times, but we also have to remember that this is part of a long history of not just oppression, because wherever there's oppression, there's also resistance. And if Native people were not a threat in the United States, if they were a sort of captured minority that had been successfully integrated and assimilated into the system, then why is it that they had to pass so many laws to criminalize protesting pipelines in this country? Why did they have to arrest and suppress the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle, the Line 3 struggle, the Bayou Bridge struggle? It's because, as one report found in 2021, in the fall of 2021, by the Indigenous Environmental Network, Indigenous-led protests, movements against fossil fuel extraction in Canada and the United States accounted for challenging a quarter of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from both countries, the highest per capita polluters, right? So this is why this is important to think about in this context, because it shows that literal people in sandals in Gaza can bring the most advanced military technologically to its knees. They cannot be defeated. They're men in sandals, right? But also it shows that these settler nations wage war on the entirety of people, not just a militarized, guerrilla group, or whatever, a faction. They waged an entire war against Native people. They had to take our children away and use them as hostages. That's the language they used. That's the language that these missionaries and these policymakers used. Use children as hostages to ensure the good behavior of these political leaders. It's the same thing that's happening in Palestine right now, but it shows the power, the people power that actually exists, that the entirety of the Palestinian resistance isn't just, those few people, the minority of Palestinian society with guns and weapons. It shows that they had to wage an entire genocidal campaign against the so-called nonviolent resistance as well, which nonviolent resistance in this sense is UNRWA schools, is education, is universities. The mere fact of just being Palestinian in an everyday kind of urban environment, that qualifies you for elimination. And it's elimination not just because they hate Palestinians. There's an economic and political and geopolitical sort of objective, right? To eliminate Palestinian resistance to ensure Western imperial domination of that particular region, much in the same way that they didn't hate our culture, our language, the way we dressed. That wasn't the reason why they targeted us for destruction. Is because we were obstinate obstacles to settler colonial access to our lands and our resources, period.
Yeah, thank you. You in talking about the logic of elimination, you covered, the vast array in which like settler colonial projects use elimination, to erase a population through culture, language, trying to erase any form of political sovereignty or political organizing, taking over land, territory, et cetera. You also mentioned the use of food, which is something that we wanted to ask you about, because right now in Gaza, we're witnessing, in addition to Israel using bombs and this extremely advanced AI technology to eliminate Palestinians in Gaza, it's also waging a war of starvation and a human, manufactured famine. So, before this genocide, again, this has just been an intensification, like you said, of the policies that have existed for decades. Before this genocide, it was the restriction on certain foods and imports into Gaza, on, fishing boundaries, which has ended up totally changing, some of the culinary practices or cuisines in Gaza, because fishermen can't fish like they were able to decades ago. And it was also the counting of calories by the Israeli occupation. So counting exactly how much calories Gazans needed to consume just to barely survive, but not to thrive. And, in the Americas, the settlers used similar techniques, even eliminating the buffalo, a major food source for Native people. So we wanted to ask you, how has food been used as a weapon and a tool of elimination from the U.S. to Palestine? And what's the logic behind this specifically in sort of weaponizing food or the absence of food, weaponizing starvation?
If we look at the Nazi genocide against Jewish people and political dissidents in Europe, we can look at the deaths. And many people, we look at like the gas chamber kind of stands in for the image of how the Nazis, had this like industrial killing machine, right? But many people died of hunger and starvation and malnutrition. And that never gets factored in because Steven Spielberg can't make a movie about that, and it's not, and even if we look at Westerns, in the United States, or even those sympathetic to indigenous people, they show the Indian massacre as sort of the defining sort of form of genocide in the Western frontier. But in fact, that's not how many people died. Many people died of disease. Many people died of malnutrition or starvation, and if you look at how Western, U.S. historians have sort of naturalized this phenomenon, they say, oh, well, indigenous people were biologically inferior and therefore they couldn't handle these European diseases. Well, if that was the case, why didn't we see a 90% die-off rate in Europe where these diseases came from? It's because conditions of war existed with the colonization of the Americas, right? So you had people who were being constantly moved from place to place, and they'll say, well, indigenous societies were hunting-gathering societies. That's actually not true. Most indigenous societies were agricultural societies that required long-term sort of habitation of specific geographies and regions. Of course, it didn't reflect European use of the land or even European agriculture, but nonetheless, it was agriculture. Even our buffalo herds, we would burn prairie grass. We would even kill off large numbers of buffalo herds and would waste. We were humans. Like, we did those things, but we also learned from our mistakes, and we try to create more sustainable practices of harvesting or even just agricultural harvesting, right? So when these European invaders came in, one of the things, like if you read the journals of Lewis and Clark, the first people who entered our first Americans in a military expedition who entered our territory, they were literally just cruising up there, in their keelboat up our river and shooting and stealing animals. It was just like a nonstop shoot fest. It was so abundant, right? And so when you see the kind of introduction of the fur trade come into our areas, it was also like a targeted elimination of our food sources and our relationship to these, to these landscapes. And so we were forced into different kind of modes of survival. This drastically changed our lives. It changed how we interact with each other, but it also created conditions in which made us more susceptible to disease and more susceptible to malnutrition, right? And so you look at some of the upper Missouri River tribes where I'm from, and you had like 95% die-off rates in some areas. And if you think about the context of, or the geography of the area where I was born and raised, there were actual settlements of 40,000 people, indigenous people in Mandan, Hidatsa, even Arikara villages on the river. I can't think of in South Dakota or North Dakota a town of 40,000 people on that river today, right? So like, think about that. Like the amount of people who had to die, and it wasn't because a settler came in and executed those people with a bullet, is because they executed them with, the diseases and the conditions of warfare that they introduced as a condition of elimination. So when we think about what's happening in Gaza, it's hard to put this into a sort of a spectacle like the massacre, like the blown up body parts, and the bodies that are being destroyed by these very advanced technologies of war. But this is nonetheless one of the most effective, if not age-old tactics of genocide, is to use food as a weapon of war and to use access to medicine as a weapon of war. The United States sanctions a third of the population of the earth. And so when we think about like a country like even like Venezuela, US sanctions under Trump resulted in the deaths of 40,000 Venezuelans. And this was a study that was done at that time. 40,000 Venezuelans, right? That's not US bullets, it's US bullets by another means, mm-hmm. right? Washington bullets, as Vijay Prashad. Washington bullets by another means, right? And so sanctions, the United States has mastered this particular weapon of warfare, right? And so Israel is literally just doing what the United States is doing to a third of mm-hmm. the global population. But in this context of an intensified ground war and aerial bombardment, it's going to have deleterious effects. And I don't even think there's this whole question of numbers. Even the U.S. Congress, I think, passed a resolution to like ban the citation of the Gaza Ministry of mm-hmm. Health and their numbers for understanding the casualties. So you can't even, we've been disallowed from even talking about the actual numbers on the ground. But we can all say, I mean, I'm not an expert in demographic and population studies, but we can all say that those numbers are a drastic undercount of what not only the people who have died, but also the people who are injured and affected. And if we think about this in the context of genocide, it affects women, it affects children, and it affects the elderly the most. And as Native people, we, I don't want to like essentialize us, but we have a reverence for elders within our society because many of our cultures were oral based. But also because of kinship, and also the fact that they represent, sort of passing on of traditions and history. And in Western society, there's I guess a disparaging sentiment towards being elderly. And I'm not talking about Joe Biden. I'm talking about people being put into nursing homes and shuttled off into basically, carceral institutions for being elderly and not sort of part of the society. And we're not talking about this destruction of an entire generation of Palestinians, the killing off of elderly people, not just through bombing, but also through starvation and the withholding of medical supplies. But also we're talking about children who will be deleteriously affected through trauma that they've experienced and will continue to experience the rest of their lives. I mean, think about Indigenous people in the United States where the United States has only just in the last couple of years acknowledged the federal Indian boarding school system. And yet my father went to a boarding school, right? And I had, generations of our family went to boarding schools, and they were traumatized by those experiences. And, 150 years later, after the federal Indian boarding school system was introduced, we still haven't gotten rid of those cycles of abuse, right? So imagine what that's going to take in a Palestinian society. That too is a form of genocide, because PTSD is a form of brain damage, right? So it's not just, thinking about, food and all these other things. It's thinking about this in a generational cycle, this, Indigenous people who've done this history. That's how we've narrated our history. That's how we narrate our sort of future, is through generations. And thinking about that in the context of the Palestinian genocide that's ongoing right now, I can't even begin to fathom the downstream effects it's going to have. So I think when we talk about food, we have to think about it in the context of, the relationship, not just to the land itself, but the temporal relationship that it has from, this generation to the next.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for those listening, they might have seen that, I believe it was, it's hard to measure time these days, I feel, but maybe last week or the week before, there was a new correspondence, a report that came out in one of the world's top medical journals, in the Lancet journal, saying that exactly what you said, Nick, that the death toll that we're seeing is far, far, far below what the reality is. And I think that report put the number close to 186,000, saying that that's actually a conservative estimate, and talking about how the effects of the starvation, of the destruction of the healthcare infrastructure in Gaza, the future of, the destruction of the sanitation network, and how that's going to contribute to the proliferation of diseases. All of these things are going to have immense impacts for years and years to come. But in talking about, different tools of elimination, we wanted to talk a little bit about incarceration and imprisonment as a tool as well. Incarceration is a core issue in Palestine, and it has been since, for decades, since the start of the occupation. One report, I believe last year, said it was estimated that at least 1 million Palestinians have been imprisoned since 1967. And since October, the levels of imprisonment and incarceration have gotten much worse. Thousands of Palestinians from Gaza and the occupied West Bank and across Palestine have been imprisoned, taken, disappeared without charge or trial, and they're being kept in absolutely horrific conditions that have led to death, disabilities, injuries, and intense psychological harm, and to levels that we haven't really fully begun to comprehend yet. But using incarceration as a tool of genocide and extermination isn't a new tactic, as we know. What do you make of how Israel is using it in the context of Palestinians, and what historical comparisons we could draw from this practice, and perhaps comparisons to the native struggle as well?
First, it's essential to sort of unpack the kind of Zionist or the colonial mentality around captive taking, hostage taking, imprisonment. of indigenous peoples. We just did an episode on our podcast around the sort of film The Searchers by John Ford, which stars John Wayne. And the whole premise of the film is these cowboy posses going out looking for these captured women or girls who were captured by Native people, right? And this is a common trope within Western and even U.S. Literature around the captivity narrative, that white people were captured by these savage tribes, and they were integrated in, and they were it was mostly women, right? This fear of rape and miscegenation, etc. But the reality, again, if we invert, like, this is an inversion of the invasion ideology, right? It's like it's the inversion of the myth of the settler and everything. It's to show that, like, it's to displace that violence onto Native people, and we see this within Western media and even the negotiations for a ceasefire. This obsession about the hostages, right? The hostages that were taken on October 7th. There's this narrative about it, right? And like how they were, the narrative, the myth of the mass rapes that took place, or systematic rapes of civilians during October 7th, the Al-Aqsa flood operation. And we see this other narrative around the sanctity of, Israelis, or even these people who were taken hostage having sympathy for Palestinians. There's a lot of cover up around that as well. But there's no talk of as you just pointed out, the million Palestinians who have been captured historically and taken hostage by the settler state itself, and the children who have been targeted and taken hostage by the settler state, and the role that incarceration plays in the colonial project, whether it's to create political prisoners, whether it's to implement collective punishment, or whether it's just to terrorize Native people in general. And if we go back to the example of boarding schools, that's not really talked about in the history of mass incarceration in the United States, even though, it affected at least a quarter of Native, people at the height of its operations, but also the legacies that resulted from what is called Indian child removal. Up into, we think, oh, well, that was in the past, as a 19th century, early 20th century thing. We're beyond that. Well, if you look at in the 1970s, there was a study that came out that found that between 25 to 35% of Native children were taken from their families and placed into non-Native families. Not Native families, mostly white families, right? So child removal is still ongoing. I live in a state, the state of Minnesota, that has one of the highest forms of child removal, Indian child removal. Even as it proclaims itself as like a progressive, it's even adopted a state ICWA law, which is kind of funny because it's still embedded within this carceral system of removing children and also criminalizing parents. But it's doing so under the auspices of apolitical reasons, not the same. It's not saying, oh, we're trying to undermine tribal governance or we're trying to destroy the family. We're doing it for benevolent reasons to save the child, right? So we're at this point right now where, but the right itself sees laws like the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, as obstacles to the larger project of eliminating tribes, because it gives tribes power over our own membership, right? To say we have the right to place our children with Native families, and our mothers, our families, our fathers, our parents should not be criminalized, and they have the right to take care of their children. This is 2024, where these arguments are still having to be made, right, in the United States. Whereas in the context of Palestine, you have administrative detentions where there's no trial, right? It's a military tribunal that is detaining people, right? And we saw this happen in similar parallels happen in places like the California prison system in the 1970s. Like George Jackson was charged with, or he was sentenced to 1 year to life in prison for a minor crime, right? George Jackson was inside, he was a leader of the guerrilla family. He also became a member of the Black Panthers. He was later assassinated. There's many assassination attempts on his life, but he was he was sentenced to 1 year to life in prison, which basically gave the prison the authority to keep him in, prison for life. And he was incarcerated, I believe, at the age of like 18. So he spent like a good portion of his life incarcerated. If we look at what's happening in Palestine right now and the way that Zionists use the prison system as a weapon of control and terrorization, it's like, I don't even, it permeates all of society, because not only are those incarcerated people in prison, their families are in prison. And oftentimes it's entire families who are imprisoned, right? Or they will target those families after this person is in prison. They'll go and raid, they'll destroy the home, they'll do all of these things. It's a form of, collective punishment. And this permeates even to the media class of the United States, right? If you look at the Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic magazine, this man, was a prison guard at a notorious Israeli prison, right? And how can you have that on your conscience? Like imagine a prison guard in the United States, who was an anti-Black prison guard, right? Who like promoted the incarceration of Black men and Black people in the United States and potentially tortured them, then became the editor of, maybe this has happened and I'm just being, glib about it, but that's essentially what Jeffrey Goldberg is. He got his start through a prison system that incarcerated people from, I think it was the first Intifada. And if you think about that in the context of like where we're at now, I think it's gotten much worse. I mean, we've seen the photos of people. There's even testimony from some of the people who were released that Ben-Gvir himself was present in some of these prisons and some of these torture scenarios as well. He himself is like advocating for the reduction of food and provisions to Palestinian prisoners, but also the prisoners movement has its own sort of history and politics, much like the political prisoner movement in the United States has. We can see how somebody like Leonard Peltier, who is a Dakota Ojibwe political prisoner incarcerated in Coleman in Florida, is incarcerated for the collective punishment of Indigenous people, right? His entire family. I've worked on his clemency campaign for many years now. I was in the hotel room next to his son when his son passed away, fighting for his father's freedom in Washington, D.C. Like they've stolen years of this man's life and his children's life from him. And it's a collective punishment against the American Indian movement and the Red Power movement in general, to say like this man will pay. He's given, a life sentence. So it's a death sentence. He's going to die an old man who has to use, he was just in the hospital. Actually, he was 4 days in the hospital recently because his health is failing. He uses a walker. But to say that somehow the Zionist kind of prison system is somehow exceptional is kind of misses the point here. But nonetheless, they're doing the exact same thing to anyone who engages in political struggle or is suspected of engaging in political struggle. And I think we have to think about it in the sense that prison is a punishment, not just of an individual, but of an entire family and an entire community.
We've talked a lot in this conversation about the parallels and some differences as well between Native and Palestinian histories and liberation struggles. I've learned so much just over the past, hour and a half, but I wanted to kind of finish off by asking you maybe a bigger picture question. Knowing how these struggles intersect, what we have in common goals. How can we utilize that knowledge as we move forward in the struggle for liberation in Palestine and on Turtle Island? What do the futures of these connected struggles look like to you?
In some ways, Palestine has awoken the world. In specific ways, it's awoken a culture of resistance that has long existed in indigenous societies in Turtle Island. Going back to what I had said earlier about these early collaborations between Palestinians and Native people of North America, that's a 50-year history. Mm-hmm. That's half a century of solidarity. I think there's a tendency within our movements to constantly invent new things, new tactics, new ways of struggle, new forms of protests, which is incredibly important. But I also think our traditions of resistance offer a foundation upon which we can build and to say, hey, actually, we're not doing anything new. We're just building on what already exists. And in that sense, that to me is very profound, because when I discovered these histories of Palestinian Native solidarities, it's not like I was looking for confirmation that they existed. My question was, why hasn't this knowledge been passed down? And it's because there's a targeted destruction of our history, right? The FBI and federal law enforcement agencies have spent lots of time and energy to destroy indigenous movements. They tried it with the American Indian movement. You can look at the examples of Leonard Peltier. They've kept him in prison for almost half a century because they don't want us to be proud of our history. Like, the first thing the colonizer tries to steal is our dignity, not our land. They try to steal our dignity. And so I think what we're seeing happen right now in Palestine is a reclamation of that dignity, right? And a reclamation to say it is our right and honor to resist, our utter destruction. And we should be proud to do that. And of course, it comes at costs that I cannot even begin to understand or fathom, as a single individual. And we shouldn't be thinking about it as single individuals, because what Palestine has taught us is that this is all of our struggle. I don't need to be indigenous. I don't need to be Black. I don't need to be a colonized person. I don't need to live in the United States to understand why this is important. I didn't need to visit Palestine to understand why the liberation of Palestine is important. All I needed to be was a human being, first and foremost. And that's what Palestine is asking every single one of us at this particular moment in time. It's a small country. It's a small place on the map, but its heart literally encompasses the globe right now. And there's something profound that we can't really understand right now that's happening. And I think it's the beginning, it's a turning point in our history. And I think, we always have to remember, it's always like darkest before dawn, and when we think that something is, an impermeable, immovable object, that's what we've been taught. We've been taught that these walls are permanent. We've been taught that these borders and these perimeter fences will never come down. And one of the things that would just I can never forget this is seeing the images of Palestinians destroy the perimeter fence, and literally could walk to the places that they're from, right? They can walk to freedom. Freedom is literally over that hill. Freedom is literally over that perimeter fence. And they're teaching us what can be overcome, right, in this particular moment in time. And it's a lesson to all of humanity. And it shows the utter moral depravity of Western imperialism in this moment, and especially in the United States. I mean, the United States it still occupies, 900 overseas military bases that encompass the entire globe. But it shows that the United States is not the moral authority on the future of humanity. Palestine is in this moment, and like the humble people of the earth. And I think that, to me, we might not have all the weapons or all the advanced technology or all the wealth in the world, but what we do have is this profound sense of hope, dignity, and vision that I think cannot be overcome by the guns and money people in this particular moment. And that's where we need to place our solidarity. That's where we need to place our time and energy and understanding. Native people also need to, in this moment, sit back and learn from, what is possible to achieve, their alternative paths towards freedom. There's alternative paths towards sovereignty. And this means that we have a lot of work to do, but nonetheless, I think it's a very hopeful moment, as much as it's incredibly devastating. And and we can, we're complex human beings, and we can hold both of those things in our hearts and minds at this moment in time. And I think it also shows the necessity of our freedom in our own homelands will have a reverberating impact in places like Palestine. Because we need to control the political destiny of this land for the sake of all of humanity, right? And I think it shows you that this generation is just not having it, right? Generation Z is like, oh, you want to take our jobs? We have no jobs. You want to take our homes? We have no homes. You want to take our wealth? We have no wealth, right? It's a dangerous position to be in. But it's also, I think, a position that grants a lot of authority to this generation and how they struggle. And I'm like very, I'm hopeful in a lot of ways, but I'm also just like, I'm cautiously optimistic about what the future holds for us.
Nick, thank you so much for joining us. For those who are listening on the podcast, or for those who are watching this on YouTube, you can find more of Nick's work on Red Media, or you can listen to his podcasts on the Red Nation podcast. And as we mentioned earlier, Nick is the author of Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. And that book is out now in paperback. Thank you so much.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the US and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.